Hey everybody, this is Paul from Thinking Christian, and what I want to do in this video is address an issue I see among some of my fellow Protestants in Protestant circles about anti-Catholicism, and it's really kind of bothering me, so I figured I'd make a video and address it. I think, I'll just say that. I just think I'm disappointed by the extent to which people think they can render a verdict on Catholicism without actually understanding it. So if you have, really what I'm trying to say here is if you have objections to Catholicism, just make sure they're not trash. In particular, it makes all of us look bad if these objections are things that are misrepresentations or that show a misunderstanding of what Catholics actually think or believe. I think Catholicism actually gets a lot of unfair flack from both Protestants and secularists, and this is like also kind of a historical thing too. There's a historical piece to this. And I find this to be particularly an issue here in the United States due to Protestant influence. Just there were a lot of things I was taught, and I'll talk about this, in US public school that was anti-Catholic. And some of this was honestly like lies and propaganda. And I don't use those terms lightly, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. And when you actually understand like what historians actually think and believe about this, I think you'll be in a much better position to evaluate things on their own merit. And it just basically bothers me when my fellow Protestants are going to argue like new atheists against Catholics. Like, at least understand what it is you're criticizing if you're going to criticize it. I'm not a Catholic, and I don't have issues with people having like challenges to Catholicism, but I do have issues with people having issues to Catholicism that are misrepresentations or they have a specific agenda. So just all I'm asking, I'm not asking you not to have objections to Catholicism. I certainly wouldn't try to like impede scholarship. I'm like, if you have questions, ask them, but just make sure they're good questions and they're not questions that have been asked and addressed, because I get the feeling that some of my Catholic friends or just Catholic people in the United States have just had to deal with a lot. And I honestly, I appreciate their patience dealing with those of us who are not perhaps as charitable as we ought to be. I'll leave it at that. And the other thing I'll say, and this will be kind of a point, Catholicism is one of the oldest and largest institutions in history, in human history. It's probably not going to be easily debunked by someone who hasn't studied history or philosophy, or it may not even be easily debunked at all. And I'll talk to you a little bit later about the ways in which Catholicism will seem internally consistent. And I want you to at least understand why it could possibly make sense to somebody. Like I said, I just don't think this is the kind of thing that's just going to be easily like, oh, well, here's a contradiction, we're done here. 2,000 years of history, time to pack it up kind of thing. We'll get into that. So there are the 5 objections I want to talk about. The fact that Catholics worship Mary. This is a claim I hear a lot. Why does the church do bad stuff? The church versus science, which is kind of another part of bullet point 2, but I think it deserves its own. Just kind of random claims about the Pope being the Antichrist. And then things that may just seem odd to us on the surface, things like transubstantiation, these sorts of things. So let's go ahead and get into it. The idea that Catholics worship Mary. The first thing I want to say is they really don't. I think this is a misrepresentation that I hear a lot. I think it would be fair to say, okay, it appears to me that Catholics revere Mary like an idol, and this bothers me, or it makes me uncomfortable, or it seems like idol worship to me. But let's make sure we're actually understanding what the practice is and why and what these rituals are, and we're not just looking at this and passing our own judgment from how things look. Let's make sure we're actually understanding what's going on here. When Catholics pray to Mary, and I had a very good conversation with one of my friends who's agnostic, but his wife is a Protestant who converted to Catholicism. And he was basically saying, and we had a conversation, and I ended up doing some more research into this. Really, when Catholics are praying to Mary or to other saints, they aren't praying to them like God. Rather, they're asking them to ask God for things on their behalf. And I think this makes sense. I mean, this should just intuitively make sense, right? If the saints are up there, if people are up there with God in heaven, it kind of seems reasonable that they would be able to hear prayers and be able to talk to God in some way. And that's, I think, why you have, the saint of this or that. They're kind of like somebody who's known for these sorts of things. And I think if you take the premise that the saints are up there with heaven, or people are up there in heaven with God, then this whole idea like makes sense, and it's clear that this isn't like worshiping them or asking for intercession of the saints is not the same as praying to them or making them have the same status as God. Now, if you doubt the premise that saints are up there with God in heaven, then I think it's fair to say, yeah, like, doesn't make sense to me. And I think then you could argue, okay, well, then prayer isn't going to do anything. But it's hard to see why it would be idolatry or false worship. Once again, there's a difference between claiming it appears to be idolatry and claiming that this is what Catholics are doing or what they actually believe by the appearance of this sort of thing. The other thing, too, I think the Catholic veneration of Mary isn't treating her like a god. And in fact, this is something that I think some other people misinterpret as well from other religions. Rather, it's not saying that Mary was God, rather that she had to have been like holy and good enough for God to have picked her to have Jesus as a child. So it's like God obviously saw a bunch of favor with her, and she was the one who bore Jesus. So like, because we love Jesus so much, obviously like his mother is like very important. And the thing I'll say for all the people that are maybe more on the liberal side, this was what Caden said in the 30s. You know, early Christianity has exalted the conception of women in the adoration given to Mary and the saints. This idea that by seeing Mary as this holy person and by basically adoring her so much, not treating her as an idol or as a god, but saying, you know, she had the womb that delivered Jesus. Maybe this womb is somehow like special. I don't know. Basically, like this has actually like this really had a big deal on people's conception of women in traditional society. So yeah, I think this is one of those areas in which, to me, it makes sense. It makes sense why Mary would be considered, if you think about it, such a like holy or wonderful figure. Like she is in some ways like the mother of God if you're a Christian. So respect to her, I think, is warranted. And I will say there are a lot of Protestants who, you know, have a similar level of respect and love for Mary as well. The next one I want to talk about is this objection. I call it like, why church do bad stuff. It's kind of like when people say, if God real, why bad thing happen? Kind of a joke, but it's just worth addressing, right? The thing I want to say first is any historical institution that's been around for thousands of years and has, you know, billions of people that represent, that are basically members, are going to have some people affiliated with it who do bad things. This is not, I don't think this should be a surprise to us. You can even argue, even in Christianity, Jesus appointed Peter, who was basically a flawed man, to represent his church. And I would argue it's not because Peter was perfect, but rather this was a demonstration of Jesus' grace and forgiveness. And even by today's standards, Catholicism probably has a better track record than any other institution in history. I mean, that's a really strong claim. So I'm not really trying to like if you find some other, you know, you could obviously like push back on that in a lot of areas. But I do think Catholicism does have a good track record when it comes to things like slavery, treatment of other religious minorities, these sorts of things. I'm not saying it has a perfect track record, but I think just understanding the history and understanding this nuance is important. If you're going to argue against some part of Catholic doctrine. Then we get into one that I hear a lot, which is the sex abuse scandal. Obviously, it's a terrible thing. And I think it would also be fair to say maybe there are ways the church could have responded better. But at the same time, there are reports that I've seen, several different reports, that indicate that teachers abuse children at a rate that's 80 to 100 times higher than priests. So it seems to me that people who are going after priests but not teachers, or not having that same level of energy, they give teachers a free pass but not priests, they're showing their true colors, and perhaps those true colors are just being anti-Catholic, or just turning Catholicism or the Pope, which we'll talk about next, into this sort of boogeyman, rather than actually looking at it at its own merits. And they're coming in with this stance of judgment rather than trying to understand, which bothers me, which is why I'm talking about this. And many of these reports of things like the Inquisition, Hitler, the Church versus Science, some of these actually are anti-Catholic propaganda, and they're actually like false, and they have origins you can trace back and be like, okay, this is where this came from, and it was false. And I will say, too, Catholics have been also on the right side of history on things like slavery and religious outsiders. So it's hard just wrap it all up and say the church is evil, the church has done all this like bad stuff. The thing you need to ask is, were these people representing the church in any official capacity? If so, yes, does this really necessarily undermine the claim that the church or Catholicism is making? The fact that there are popes that maybe did bad things. In fact, I even think there's some Catholics who think there are popes that are likely in hell because they did bad stuff. But that doesn't necessarily like disprove Catholicism. So I think that's, once again, I think a lot of these objections are more emotional. They're more like, I don't like it. And that's fair to say you don't like it, but let's make sure this isn't a logical objection. This is just you being uncomfortable or you not liking something about it, which is fair to say you don't like it or you have problems with certain things, but those problems don't make it untrue. Then we get on to the church versus science. This is kind of interesting. I was really taught this sort of stuff. So this is why I'm making this video. If you weren't taught this stuff, maybe it won't make sense why I'm making this video, but I was taught things in public school, things like, okay, the Catholic Church thought the earth was flat, and Christopher Columbus was going to sail to India to prove them wrong. And he did this, and it's this sort of, once again, the Catholic Church being the boogeyman of authority and oppression and stifling free thinking. Actually, what happened, what I learned later, is the Catholic Church thought the earth was spherical and actually thought it was the correct radius that it is. And it was Columbus who thought he did calculations that were wrong, that calculated the earth being smaller than it was. And if North America wasn't there, Columbus was trying to go to India, he would have actually just died at sea if it was just ocean, if there was no continent. So he ended up finding another continent because a continent was there, and he wouldn't have found it because otherwise, his calculations were incorrect, basically. That's why he ended up in North America, and he would have died otherwise. So completely goes against this. In fact, you can basically track this down to somebody who was like an literary author who came up with this story that the Catholic Church thought the earth was flat, and it's persisted ever since, but it's false. Also under stuff by things like the Galileo affair. It's much more simple than just the church was trying to stifle science. The church actually didn't really have a problem with Galileo publishing his results. It was really the way that he did it and the way he went after the Pope, and it caused some tensions there. So just make sure, there are people like Voltaire who it's very clear they have a bone to pick with the church, and this makes sense given their political context. But in retrospect, when you actually look at all the evidence, make sure you're being fair about this. Make sure you understand the nuances of what's actually going on here. The other thing I'll say is, the contributions of Catholic clergy to science and philosophy really cannot be overstated. Like the Big Bang Theory was proposed by a Catholic priest. A lot of great people in history, in philosophy, and science have been Catholics, especially in philosophy, I think. Catholicism has dominated Western philosophy and the natural sciences longer than any other culture or institution in history by a long shot. Should be no surprise that they have a strong culture of science and philosophy. So trying to make Catholics look like anti-intellectuals or something like that, I just think, I don't know, it just bothers me. There are a lot of, it's funny, as I've been reading some more philosophy, it's like almost like, oh, I learned this person's like just somehow Catholic and I didn't realize this before I read it. And I'm like no longer surprised about this. Like people like G.E.M. Anscombe, I guess Alasdair MacIntyre, but I didn't know that before. Charles Taylor, and then other people who just have a long history, Frederick Copleston, these sorts of people, Peter Kreeft. Something about the Catholic Church has inspired a very solid culture of science and philosophy, and I think that's a really wonderful thing to Western culture. And regardless if you're Catholic or not, I think just recognize that, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And one thing you could argue too is something like the church was needed for science in the first place. This is a point one of my favorite atheist historians, Tim O'Neill, says. He says the development of modern science was likely needed, or it likely needed the sort of institutional body and stable political system that the Catholic Church provided during the sort of Middle Ages. So, what is it that provides grounds for science and a scientific institution, these sorts of things? Well, the church contributed to that quite a bit. And there's a reason modern science came out of the Catholic Church and nowhere else in the world. So once again, my point is at least to think about these things, right? To at least try to see the side here and not just immediately render a judgment. And then there's the Pope equals the Antichrist. And I feel like in some ways this is very ridiculous, so I don't even have to mention it. But I grew up hearing this too, so I do understand. And maybe to a certain point I ended up believing it, but I think I was always maybe a little bit skeptical of this point. I think to Catholics, the Pope is not a stand-in for Jesus. Rather, he's sort of the person who represents Jesus on earth. So he's kind of like, and I make this point later, he's sort of like the president of the church. He is not a stand-in for Jesus, but he is the person that is sort of appointed by succession to do this. Now, you can deny apostolic succession. I mean, I don't have a problem with that. But the claim the church has is that Jesus appointed Peter, and Peter was like the first pope, and then basically that succession can be tracked down all the way down to the current pope. So they've basically, Jesus appointed Peter as the head of his church, and Peter appointed someone, and all these people. Now, if you're going to doubt Catholic claims to apostolic succession, you need to go after that claim, right? Whether Peter was the first pope, whether that succession is correct. But I hope it makes sense. At least it's plausible to me why something like the papacy would make sense. Why you would have somebody who represents God or God's will on earth while Jesus isn't around, to sort of maybe make sense of certain doctrinal matters, or to arbitrate when there are conflicts, to kind of provide some sort of guidance. And I'll never forget this. I remember asking one of my, this is a bandmate of mine who's actually a Seventh-day Adventist Bible teacher. And I asked this question to him, like, oh, what would your response be to this verse in Isaiah? And he actually provided another, a verse and why he didn't believe it. So he had thought this through too. But he basically told me, he's like, look, pretty much everything in Catholicism is internally consistent. Like don't think that they don't have good reasons for believing the stuff that they do, because they do. And this is a Seventh-day Adventist who tend to be actually pretty anti-Catholic. These are the people that I think do tend to claim that, in some ways, that the Pope is the Antichrist. And this was him telling me this about internal consistency. So something interesting to think about. Just maybe things aren't exactly what they seem. And that's kind of goes into the next point I want to make, right? There are things to us that may seem odd at first glance that my guess is the church has a very good reason for thinking or believing or doing. And let's make sure we listen and we understand what these things are first before rendering a judgment on them. I hear a lot of Protestants and secular people that are kind of like, yeah, transubstantiation is a weird thing. Like, what the heck? This turns into the actual body and blood of Jesus. And I'll admit, yeah, that's a hard teaching. But I would also say pretty much all of Christianity is kind of weird if you think about it. And I say this as like, I would consider myself a very, very devout Christian. But if you're like looking at this from the outside, if you've never heard of Christianity, at least admit how, I don't want to use the word absurd, but just how strange it actually sounds. Like God, the creator of the universe, like decides to come down and take on the form of a person and then dies. Like this is not something that seems like, I mean, like when you just hear somebody say that, right? It's going to sound weird and ridiculous. And then you look into it and you start reading arguments and it starts, I don't know, God forbid, making sense. And my guess is for something like transubstantiation, this is kind of the same way. There are reasons for the fact that people believe it. It's okay if you don't believe it, but just make sure you have good reasons and that you've understood the reasons why you don't believe it. This is kind of what Adam Smith said, right? You need to know, it's not enough to just know your own reasons for your own position. To really claim that you're like strong in your own reasons, you should also know the reasons for the other side and be able to either give a response or have a good reason why you don't believe those reasons. And here's the thing, I have Catholic friends and some of them are, and then even agnostic friends who basically like, look, if you have a question, there's a good chance Catholics have an answer to it. Somebody's probably thought about it before. If you just look in the literature, look in history, or find someone who's Catholic who's able to answer this question, there's probably a good chance that there's an answer to it. Yeah, it's pretty much, and at a certain point, once you do this, you kind of start realizing like, okay, these questions have been answered enough by me. I'm going to practically, the next time I have a question, there's probably a good answer to that too. That's kind of the point that I'm at. Like, okay, Catholicism does seem pretty internally consistent because of these reasons. I would also say their views on marriage make a lot of sense to me too. I remember I had the same reaction, like, wait, you can't get a divorce? Like, well, what if somebody cheats? Well, what if this? What if that? And as I started thinking about it and hearing responses, I was kind of like, no, wait a minute, this actually does make a lot of sense to me. And I was coming in with my own views or my own ideas, but understanding like what the teaching and what the history was, it actually did make sense to me. So like point here is just understand the reasons. You don't have to agree with them, but at least understand them and try to go in with an attitude of listening rather than debunking. There is one thing I don't understand, which is the church's view on contraception and natural family planning. But given the track record of answers I've gotten, there's probably a good answer to that yet, and I just maybe haven't looked hard enough, so I'll keep looking. But yeah, really my point is make sure you just understand the nuances of things like the Crusades before rendering a verdict on anything. It's very easy to find something and say, okay, this looks like an objection, let me just throw this out there. But this isn't always done in good faith, where we're saying, okay, this seems like an objection, but has there been a response to this objection such that, or has somebody else thought about this too and offered this as an objection, and what would their answers be? And does their response actually undercut the objection that I would have possibly had? That's really all I wanted to say about that. Here's a couple great readings. The main one here is Rodney Stark's Bearing False Witness. Rodney Stark is not a Catholic either, and he wrote this book about basically, it's like 10 or so anti-Catholic lies. And some of these I discussed a little bit, but I got his book because I was on a Christian forum, and I was basically like, hey, look, I started feeling like, given my secular Protestant upbringing, I was given an unfair treatment of what it is Catholics actually believed. This was like the incongruency of what I was taught that Catholics believed and what some of my Catholic friends were actually telling me that Catholics believed. And I'm like, wait a minute, somebody's there's some disconnect here. Somebody's lying or something. Then somebody recommended me this book, and it's great. I think it's even free on Audible. So it's great. Gregory Boyle's Tattoos on the Heart. It was an amazing book. I had to read it for a class at a secular university, actually. Really interesting. Frederick Copleston's History of Philosophy. Anything by Alasdair MacIntyre, especially After Virtue. I think After Virtue is one of my favorite books of all time. Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, is also great. And then Peter Kreeft has a bunch of good stuff. He has this really good book, Socrates Meets Jesus, which is, it's excellent. It's kind of like a play. It's very easy read, very fun. It's got a lot of humor in it, things like that. It was actually recommended to me by Stephen West, who is the host of the show Philosophize This. He kind of recommended it, even though I think he's an agnostic, but he obviously really enjoyed the book, and I picked it up, and I really enjoyed it, and it's a fun read. So Peter Kreeft is a professor at Boston College, and I had some friends who went there and stuff. So anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm afraid there are going to be a bunch of my fellow Protestants who come in there trying to defend some of these attacks. And like I said, I don't want to claim I'm like defending the church's doctrines or defending the truth of Catholicism as much as just trying to say, let's have good reasons and productive conversations, as opposed to just having what I said originally, trash objections. So anyway, thanks for watching. Yeah, have a great day. Have a blessed day. That's what I'll say today. Have a blessed day.